Blood dripped from the shattered chandelier, pooling on the Italian marble floor of the Moretti estate. The most feared man in New York wiped his jaw, his dark eyes locked on the woman everyone had laughed at just hours before. She didn't flinch. As the heavy steel doors locked them in, he stepped over a groaning bodyguard and snarled, "You belong with me." He thought he had captured a pawn. He had no idea he had just cornered the Queen. The air inside the sprawling Southampton estate was thick with the scent of imported orchids, expensive cigars, and dangerous secrets. It was the annual gathering of the East Coast's most lucrative and lethal families, a masquerade of high society where the champagne was shipped directly from Epernay, and the security perimeter was enforced by men carrying suppressed submachine guns beneath their tailored tuxedos. Dominic Moretti stood on the sweeping mahogany staircase, a glass of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon sweating in his grip. At 32, Dominic was the undisputed head of the Moretti crime family. He had inherited a crumbling empire, and through sheer, unadulterated violence and a terrifying intellect, forged it into a syndicate that controlled everything from the shipping ports in Brooklyn to the political backrooms in Albany. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes, a cold, dead obsidian, missed absolutely nothing. Tonight was supposed to be a standard show of force, a night to remind the other families who held the leash. But Dominic's cold calculus was abruptly interrupted when the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open. Genevieve Laurent walked into the room, and the symphony of hushed, arrogant chatter faltered. She did not look like the women who usually populated Dominic's world. The Mafia wives and mistresses were a parade of carbon copies, starved frames, surgically enhanced features, and faces pulled tight with Botox and anxiety. Genevieve was a stark, breathtaking contrast. She was fat. Her body was a lush, unapologetic landscape of heavy curves and soft, commanding lines, draped in a custom crimson silk gown that clung to her waist and cascaded over her wide hips. The dress was a masterpiece, leaving her thick, creamy shoulders bare, a fortune in vintage Cartier diamonds resting against her deep décolletage. She moved with a slow, predatory grace that commanded the space around her. She wasn't hiding her size. She was weaponizing it. The whispers began almost immediately, vicious and biting, rippling through the crowd of elite criminals. "Who brought the pastry, chef?" a sharply angled woman in emerald green muttered, hiding her sneer behind a crystal champagne flute. "Must be one of Donovan's new distractions," another replied, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "So he always did have a bizarre charity complex." Dominic heard the whispers. He saw the disdain flashing in the eyes of the men who evaluated women based strictly on their trophy value. But Dominic saw something else entirely. He watched the way Genevieve held her chin, tilted just a fraction of an inch upward. He watched the way her dark, heavy-lidded eyes swept over the room, not with the awe or fear of an outsider, but with the chilling boredom of a predator surveying a cage full of very small, very loud birds. "Vittorio," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver of dread down his underboss's spine. Vittorio stepped out from the shadows of the velvet drapery. "Yes, boss." "Who is she?" Dominic asked, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, the burn of the alcohol matching the sudden, uncharacteristic heat flaring in his chest. Vittorio followed Dominic's gaze and frowned, adjusting the cuffs of his Brioni suit. "Nobody of consequence, from what we can tell. Name on the guest list is Genevieve Laurent, Flew in private to Teterboro this morning, but the jet is registered to a shell corporation out of the Caymans. No known family ties. The rumor mill says she's the estranged daughter of some washed-up French banker, probably looking for a sugar daddy who won't mind the extra baggage. Dominic's eyes narrowed, a dangerous spark igniting in the dark depths. The rumor mill is run by idiots, Vittorio. Look at her. Genevieve had reached the edge of the dance floor. A waiter, trembling slightly under the oppressive atmosphere of the room, fumbled and spilled a drop of red wine on the polished floor near her heel. A nearby capo, a brute named Carmine, barked a harsh insult at the kid, raising a heavy hand to strike him. Genevieve didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply turned her head, fixing Carmine with a stare so intensely cold, so completely devoid of human empathy, that the massive enforcer froze mid-swing. For 3 agonizing seconds, she held his gaze. Carmine, a man who broke kneecaps for a living, actually took a step back, swallowing hard, his raised hand dropping uselessly to his side. Genevieve smiled, a devastating, painted curve of her plush lips, and elegantly waved the terrified waiter away. Dominic felt a visceral punch to his gut. It was an unfamiliar cocktail of raw lust and primal intrigue. Women didn't look at his men like that. Hell, most men didn't look at his men like that. She was an anomaly. A heavy, beautiful puzzle wrapped in red silk and Cartier. "She's not looking for a sponsor," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, his eyes locked on the way the silk hugged the swell of her stomach and the deep curve of her hips. "She's not acting like prey." "She's out of her depth, boss," Vittorio cautioned, misreading Dominic's interest for suspicion. These women, they don't survive long in our world if they don't know their place. She's too conspicuous. "Conspicuous," Dominic repeated, testing the word on his tongue. He handed his half-empty glass to Vittorio without looking away from Genevieve. "That's exactly why she's dangerous, and exactly why I'm going to find out what she tastes like." Leaving his underboss gaping on the stairs, Dominic descended into the ballroom. The crowd parted for him instinctively, a sea of violent men and ruthless women stepping aside for the apex predator. He didn't care about the deals he was supposed to be brokering tonight. He didn't care about the shipments arriving at the docks. His entire universe had suddenly shrunk to the radius of a woman who defied every rule of his brutal world simply by existing. How was Dominic Moretti? He took what he wanted, broke what resisted, and owned everything in his path, and as he watched Genevieve Laurent run a manicured finger over the rim of a martini glass, completely unbothered by the wolves circling her, Dominic decided one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to own her. The VIP lounge of the estate was a dimly lit sanctuary of mahogany, leather, and cigar smoke, cordoned off from the main ballroom by heavy velvet ropes and 2 armed guards. Genevieve Laurel sat in a high-backed armchair, the plush leather yielding to her soft, heavy curves. She held a glass of sparkling water, her expression completely detached as she listened to the low, frantic murmurs of the men conducting illegal commerce a few feet away. She knew they were laughing at her. She could feel the condescending weight of their stares, the sneers directed at her thick thighs and round stomach. Let them laugh, she thought, taking a delicate sip of her water. The arrogance of thin, stupid men had always been her greatest advantage. A sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure warned her a second before the shadow fell over her. "You look bored, Miss Laurent." Genevieve didn't jump. She slowly turned her head, her dark eyes tracing the immaculate line of a custom Italian tuxedo up to the violently handsome face of Dominic Moretti. She knew exactly who he was. She knew the exact sum in his offshore accounts in Zurich, knew the names of the politicians in his pocket, and knew precisely how many bodies he had buried under the new stadium in Queens. I find that most men who try too hard to be intimidating end up being rather tedious, Mr. Moretti, Genevieve replied, her voice smooth and rich, completely devoid of the breathless fear he was accustomed to extracting from women. Dominic's jaw ticked. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his features before settling back into a dangerous smirk. He didn't ask for permission before sitting on the low table directly in front of her chair, invading her personal space. He leaned in, the scent of bergamot, expensive tobacco, and underlying violence washing over her. Most men are tedious, Dominic agreed, his obsidian eyes dropping to trace the swell of her cleavage before dragging back up to her face. But I'm not most men. And you? You shouldn't be here. A woman like you, in a room full of sharks, is bound to get bitten. Are you offering to protect me? Genevieve asked, a mocking lilt to her tone. She shifted her weight, intentionally allowing the slit of her crimson dress to fall open, revealing a thick, creamy thigh. Dominic's gaze snapped to the exposed skin, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering just an inch above her knee. The heat radiating from him was palpable. I'm offering to claim you, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper meant only for her. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, walking in here wrapped in silk, letting these peasants whisper about you. But the game is over. From this second forward, you answer to me. Genevieve let out a soft, melodic laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. It was the laugh of a woman who had never known subjugation. You are terribly presumptuous. Has anyone ever told you that? Before Dominic could respond, the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge banged open. Donovan Reed, the volatile head of the Irish syndicate from Hell's Kitchen, stormed into the room. Donovan's face was flushed with alcohol and rage, a jagged scar pulling at the corner of his mouth. Moretti! Donovan roared, drawing the attention of every bodyguard and capo in the room. Weapons were discreetly unholstered. The air turned brittle. Dominic didn't even look at the screaming mob boss. He kept his eyes locked on Genevieve, slowly pulling his hand back. Excuse me for a moment, Genevieve. It seems the help forgot their manners. Dominic stood up, buttoning his jacket with terrifying calmness, and turned to face Donovan. You're loud, Donovan. I hate loud noises. You hijacked 3 of my transport trucks on the I-95 corridor this morning, Donovan spat, stepping into Dominic's space, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into an open grave. That was my product. 2 million in pharmaceuticals gone. Genevieve watched over the rim of her glass. She noted the exact placement of Dominic's guards. She noted the sweat beading on Donovan's forehead. This was the raw, unrefined brutality of street-level mafia politics. It was messy, uncivilized. You owed me $3 million from the botched casino deal in Atlantic City, Dominic said, his voice flat, emotionless. I took collateral. Consider the remaining $1 million an asshole tax for interrupting my conversation. Donovan snarled, his hand dropping toward the inside of his jacket. It was a fatal, amateur mistake. Dominic moved with a speed that defied his large frame. He sidestepped Donovan's sloppy draw, grabbing the Irishman's wrist and twisting it with a sickening crack. As Donovan screamed, dropping his weapon to the carpet, Dominic grabbed him by the throat and slammed him backward onto a glass coffee table. The glass shattered perfectly, a spiderweb of violent destruction. Blood sprayed across the fine Persian rug. Donovan choked, gasping for air as Dominic's knee pinned his chest to the floor. Dominic's customized Kimber, 1911, pressed firmly against the center of Donovan's forehead. The entire room held its breath. The silence was absolute, save for the wet, ragged gasps of the bleeding Irishman. Dominic didn't look at the man he was about to execute. Instead, he turned his head, his dark, manic eyes locking directly onto Genevieve. He wanted to see her scream. He wanted to see her flawless composure shatter. He wanted to see the exact moment she realized she was entirely at his mercy, trapped in the den of a monster. Genevieve sat perfectly still. She looked at the blood soaking into the rug. She looked at the gun in Dominic's hand. Then she looked up and met Dominic's crazed stare. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed her thick legs. She reached out, plucked a fresh strawberry from a silver platter on the side table, and took a delicate bite. The red juice stained her lips, mirroring the blood on the floor. She chewed, swallowed, and gave Dominic a look of profound, unimpressed boredom. The gun in Dominic's hand trembled, not from fear, but from an overwhelming surge of adrenaline and obsession. Who the hell was this woman? He shoved off Donovan, letting his men drag the bleeding boss out by his heels. Dominic holstered his weapon, wiped a drop of blood from his cuff, and walked back to Genevieve. He leaned down, placing a hand on each arm of her chair, caging her in. His chest heaved slightly, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive fire. "You don't run. You don't scream," Dominic breathed, his face inches from hers, the smell of cordite and blood mixing with his cologne. "I don't find messy temper tantrums particularly frightening," Genevieve whispered back, her gaze dropping to his lips, before rising to his eyes. Dominic's hands gripped the leather of the chair tight enough to tear it. The room around ceased to exist. "You belong with me," he snarled, the words vibrating with a promise of violence and raw devotion. "I don't care where you came from. I don't care who you think you are. You're mine now." Genevieve offered a small, cryptic smile, her eyes hiding a secret that was about to bring the mighty Dominic Moretti to his knees. "We shall see about that, Dominic." The armored Maybach S680 glided through the midnight rain, its heavy tires whispering over the slick asphalt of the FDR drive. Inside the cavernous, leather-scented cabin, the silence was absolute. The partition separating the driver was raised. The world outside was a blur of yellow taxicabs and the towering, glittering teeth of the Manhattan skyline. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly intimate. Dominic Moretti sat in the corner of the plush leather bench, one arm draped over the center console, his obsidian eyes burning a hole into the side of Genevieve's face. He had effectively kidnapped her. Following the bloody execution of Donovan Reed's dignity in the VIP lounge, Dominic had simply gripped the small of Genevieve's soft, wide back, bypassed her invisible security detail, and guided her to his waiting motorcade. He expected resistance. He expected a demand for a lawyer or a terrified plea for her life. Instead, Genevieve had smoothly slid into the back of his vehicle, adjusted the crimson silk pooling around her thick thighs, and poured herself a measure of the 50-year-old Macallan, resting in the crystal decanter between them. "You are uncommonly quiet for a woman who has just been abducted by the Cosa Nostra," Dominic murmured, the amber liquid in his own glass catching the passing streetlights. Genevieve took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch, savouring the peat and smoke before she turned her head. Her dark eyes reflected the city lights, sparkling with a terrifyingly calm amusement. "Abduction implies I am being taken somewhere against my will, Dominic, or that you have the capacity to keep me anywhere I do not wish to be." Dominic let out a low, predatory chuckle. The sheer arrogance of this woman, wrapped in her heavy, magnificent curves, was a drug he was rapidly becoming addicted to. She wasn't a fragile, trembling doe. She was a mountain, immovable and completely unbothered by the wolves circling her base. "My penthouse occupies the top 3 floors of a high-rise in Tribeca," Dominic said, leaning closer, the scent of his bergamot cologne mixing with the expensive smoke of the scotch. "It has biometric locks that require my retinal scan, a private elevator that can only be summoned with my fingerprints, and a security detail comprised of ex-Mossad operatives who shoot first and ask questions never. If you try to walk out of those doors without my permission, you will not make it to the lobby." "How wonderfully archaic," Genevieve sighed, her tone dripping with genuine pity. She shifted her weight, the movement deliberately slow, forcing Dominic's gaze to drop to the deep, soft plunge of her neckline. "You men and your little fortresses. You rely on guns and fingerprint scanners because you lack the imagination to control a room with anything else." The Maybach pulled into a subterranean garage beneath a sleek, glass-fronted tower. The heavy steel doors rolled shut behind them, sealing them in a concrete bunker bathed in harsh fluorescent light. 3 Suburbans filled with armed men were already waiting, securing the perimeter before Dominic's driver even put the car in park. Dominic didn't move. He reached across the console, his large hand wrapping around Genevieve's thick, soft wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but the grip was an undeniable tether. "I control the room because I own the building, Genevieve. I own the politicians who zoned it, the police who patrol the block, and the judges who would throw out any warrant against me. You are in my city now." Genevieve looked down at the hand caging her wrist. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her face inches from his, the heat of her skin radiating against his jaw. "New York is a port town, Dominic. It belongs to whoever controls the ocean, and you are playing in the shallows." Before he could dissect the warning in her words, the door was pulled open by Vittorio. The penthouse was exactly as Dominic had described, a sprawling, cold monument to wealth and paranoia. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass offered a 360-degree view of the city. The furniture was minimal, severe, and expensive. Imported Italian leather and brushed steel. It was the home of a man who didn't plan on being comfortable, only secure. Genevieve kicked off her diamond-encrusted heels, letting her bare feet sink into the plush Tibetan rug. She walked toward the massive glass window overlooking the Hudson River, completely ignoring the 4 armed guards standing by the elevator bank. She didn't cower. She didn't look for an exit. She simply claimed the space, her lush, crimson-draped figure the only vibrant thing in the monochromatic fortress. Dominic dismissed the guards with a sharp flick of his chin, as the elevator doors hissed shut, leaving them utterly alone. He unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and tossed it over a chair. He walked up behind her, his chest brushing against the soft, warm expanse of her bare back. "Who are you running from?" Dominic asked, his voice a low rasp near her ear. "The Shell Corporation in the Caymans, the private jet. The complete lack of a digital footprint prior to 3 years ago. You're a ghost, Genevieve. A very beautiful, very expensive ghost. Did you steal from the wrong cartel? Are you hiding from a husband who didn't appreciate the weight of the gold he was holding?" Genevieve laughed, a rich, throaty sound that vibrated against his chest. She turned around, effectively trapping herself between the glass and Dominic's massive frame. She looked up at him, her eyes completely devoid of the fear he was so desperate to extract from her. "I am not running, Dominic," she said softly, reaching up to trace the line of his sharp jaw with a manicured fingernail. "I am hunting, and you were foolish enough to invite the wolf into your cage and lock the door behind her." Dominic's breath hitched. He grabbed her waist, his large hands sinking into the soft, heavy flesh of her hips, pulling her flush against him. The physical contrast was staggering, his hard, violent edges meeting the yielding, overwhelming power of her curves. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. "Then bite me," he challenged, his voice dripping with dark obsession. Genevieve smiled, a terrifying curve of red lips. "Not yet. I want to see you bleed first." The following morning, the atmosphere in the Tribeca penthouse was toxic. The storm hadn't broken over the city, but inside Dominic's war room, a soundproof, glass-walled office situated on the mezzanine level, the temperature had plummeted to absolute zero. Dominic stood at the head of a massive slate conference table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, exposing the dark ink of his family crest on his forearm. Surrounding him were his top lieutenants, Vittorio, Dante, and a grizzled financial fixer named Arthur. All of them looked as though they had just been handed their own death warrants. "Read it to me again," Dominic ordered, his voice dangerously soft. Arthur, a man who had laundered money for the cartel for 3 decades without ever breaking a sweat, wiped his forehead with a trembling silk handkerchief. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the encrypted iPad on the table. "As of 6:00 a.m. this morning, boss, we no longer control the Brooklyn shipping yards," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. "The holding company we use to mask our ownership, Zenith Logistics, was subjected to a hostile takeover overnight. Someone bought up 80% of our leveraged debt through a blind trust operating out of Luxembourg. They called the debt in immediately. When the shell companies couldn't produce the liquid cash within the 4-hour penalty window, the trust seized the assets." Dominic's jaw ticked so hard it threatened to shatter his teeth. The Brooklyn yards were the art that pumped narcotics, weapons, and untraceable cash into his empire. Losing them wasn't just a financial hit. It was a decapitation. "Who?" Dominic barked, slamming his fist onto the slate table, causing the heavy crystal ashtrays to jump. "Who has the capital and the infrastructure to orchestrate a silent buyout of that magnitude in under 12 hours? Not the Russians, not the Irish. Donovan is currently breathing through a tube in a private clinic. Who is hitting us?" Vittorio swallowed hard, staring at his own tablet. "It gets worse, Dominic. It's not just the shipping yards, the commercial real estate fronts we use in Manhattan. The leases were transferred, the offshore accounts in the Caymans. Frozen. We are being financially dismantled, piece by piece. The only signature on the seizure documents is a corporate stamp for an entity called the Laurent Syndicate. The room fell deathly silent. Dominic froze. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Laurent. He turned slowly, his eyes dragging upward toward the open balcony overlooking the war room. Genevieve was standing there. She had changed out of the crimson gown and was now wearing a custom, midnight blue silk robe that draped magnificently over her wide, heavy frame. She held a cup of black coffee in one hand, leaning against the glass railing, watching the chaos unfold below, with the serene detachment of a queen watching peasants squabble over bread. "Vittorio," Dominic commanded, his voice eerily calm as his eyes remained locked on the woman above him. "Run the name of our guest." Vittorio frantically tapped his screen. "Genevieve Laurent, the banker's daughter, boss. Like I said yesterday. Dig deeper. Access the Interpol ghost files. Look for the European shadow markets," Dominic demanded, his heart pounding a violent rhythm against his ribs. Genevieve didn't wait for Vittorio to find the answer. She turned and began a slow, deliberate descent down the floating glass staircase. Every eye in the room snapped to her. The capos instinctively reached for the weapons concealed under their jackets, unsettled by the sudden, terrifying shift in the room's power dynamic. "Save your analyst the trouble, Dominic," Genevieve said, her voice echoing clearly in the vast space. Her bare feet made no sound on the glass steps. "The banker you thought was my father was merely an employee. I bought his bank when I was 24 and liquidated it to fund my first acquisition in Marseille." She reached the bottom of the stairs and walked straight toward the slate table. The men, hardened killers, who had butchered rivals with machetes, unconsciously parted to let her through. She didn't just take up space with her body. She consumed the oxygen in the room with an aura of absolute, crushing dominance. "You," Arthur whispered, his face draining of all color as he stared at her. "The Laurent Syndicate, the European Consortium. You're Madame L. Madame L is a theatrical title invented by terrified men who needed a boogeyman to blame for their own incompetence," Genevieve replied smoothly, stopping directly across from Dominic. "I prefer Genevieve." Dominic stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with violent clarity. The lack of the custom private jet, the way she had looked at his men like they were insects. She wasn't a civilian. She wasn't a pawn. She was the apex predator of the global shadow economy. The Laurent Syndicate controlled the ports in Europe, the untraceable banking in Switzerland, and the political underworld of half the G7 nations. "You orchestrated this," Dominic breathed, his hands gripping the table. "You sat in my car, drank my scotch, and slept in my bed while your people dismantled my empire." Genevieve set her coffee cup down on the slate. "I warned you, Dominic. You play in the shallows. New York is a profitable port, but it has been terribly mismanaged under your reign. You are loud. You are messy. You beat men bloody in VIP lounges over petty grievances. It is bad for business." "You think you can just walk in here and take my city?" Dominic roared, the facade of his composure finally shattering. He drew his Kimber 1911 in a flash of dark steel, aiming it squarely at the center of her chest. Vittorio, Dante, and Arthur froze. Genevieve didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply looked down at the barrel of the gun, then back up into Dominic's frantic, furious eyes. She stepped forward, her heavy breasts brushing directly against the muzzle of the weapon. "Pull the trigger, Dominic," she whispered, her voice a deadly, hypnotic caress. "Kill me, and watch what happens next." The biometric locks on your penthouse have already been overridden by my tech team. Your security detail downstairs has been bought. They now work for me. The accounts holding your personal wealth have been drained and routed to a sanctuary server in Monaco. If my heart stops beating, every shred of evidence linking you to the district attorney's assassination last year will be automatically emailed to the FBI, the DEA, and the New York Times. Dominic's breath ragged in his chest. His finger trembled on the trigger. He was a king who had just realized his castle had been built on a trapdoor, and this beautiful, heavy, terrifying woman held the lever. Genevieve reached up, her soft, warm hand wrapping around the cold steel of the gun barrel. With a gentle but firm pressure, she pushed the weapon down until it pointed at the floor. "I didn't come to New York to be your captive, Dominic," Genevieve said softly, a dark, victorious smile blooming on her red lips. "I came to acquire you. You belong with me." The silence in the war room was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath from a lesser man's lungs. Dominic Moretti, the undisputed apex predator of the eastern seaboard, stared at the lowered barrel of his Kimber 1911 and then into the fathomless dark eyes of Genevieve Laurent. The air smelled of ozone, expensive espresso, and the sharp, metallic tang of impending violence. But the violence did not come. Dominic slowly holstered his weapon. The click of the safety engaging sounded like a guillotine dropping in the quiet room. He didn't surrender. A king like Dominic did not know how to bow. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes mapping the lush, unapologetic landscape of her body, wrapped in the midnight blue silk, recalibrating everything he thought he knew about power. She had walked into his fortress, bypassed his ex-military security, seized his multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, and done it all without firing a single shot or breaking a sweat. Genevieve moved past him, a slow, deliberate glide that commanded the air currents in the room. She bypassed the empty chairs and took the seat at the absolute head of the slate conference table, Dominic's seat. She sank into the black leather, crossing her thick, pale thighs. The silk robe parted just enough to offer a devastating glimpse of the soft, heavy curve of her calf, ending in bare toes, painted a deep blood red. "Arthur," Genevieve said, her voice a smooth, rich purr that sent a visible shiver down the old fixer's spine. "Close your mouth. It is unbecoming of a man who managed to hide $60 million in a Zurich blind trust last fiscal year." Arthur choked, his face flushing violently. How could you possibly know about the Zurich accounts? They are completely unlisted. The encryption was coded by a firm in Tel Aviv that I acquired 3 years ago, Genevieve interrupted, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. "Your money is safe, Arthur. In fact, it is currently accruing a much higher interest rate on a sovereign server in Luxembourg. You will find the new routing numbers in your encrypted inbox." She turned her gaze to Vittorio and Dante, who were still standing frozen near the glass staircase, their hands hovering dangerously close to their holstered weapons. "You two. Your loyalty to Dominic is commendable, rare in this gutter of an industry. But your tactical execution in the Brooklyn yards has been sloppy. You bleed revenue to the Russian Bratva because you react instead of anticipate. That ends today." Dominic watched her, a dark, dangerous heat blooming in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with anger. It was an intoxicating, chaotic mixture of raw lust and profound professional awe. He had spent his entire life surrounded by women who were accessories, fragile birds who looked away when the blood started flowing. Genevieve was not a bird. She was a dragon, resting comfortably on a mountain of gold, entirely unimpressed by the men waving swords at her base. He walked slowly toward the table, pulling out the chair directly to her right, the seat of the underboss. He sat down, leaning his massive frame forward, his forearms resting on the cold slate. He invaded her space, bringing the scent of bergamot and danger with him. "You didn't come here to destroy me, Genevieve," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for her ears despite the audience. "If you wanted me dead, I would have had a stroke in my sleep, and my empire would have been auctioned off by morning. You went through the trouble of trapping me. Why?" Genevieve turned her head. Her face was inches from his. He could see the faint, beautiful dusting of freckles across her nose, the plush fullness of her lips without the red lipstick from the night before. "Because an architect needs a hammer, Dominic," she whispered back. "I control the global supply chains. I own the politicians in Brussels and the bankers in Geneva. But the European consortium lacks the street-level brutality required to hold physical territory in North America. When they try to squeeze my distribution lines in New York, I need a man who will not hesitate to mail them their own teeth." She reached out, her soft, ring-covered fingers tracing the dark ink of the Moretti crest on his exposed forearm. The contrast of her pale, soft hand against his hardened, scarred muscle was violently erotic. "I don't want your city," she continued, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I want to give you the world. I want to build a monopoly so terrifying, so absolute, that the governments of this planet pay us taxes just to keep the lights on. But I will not do it with a partner who acts like a street thug, throwing tantrums in a VIP lounge. You will learn precision, Dominic, or I will replace you." The threat was not empty. It was a cold, hard promise. Before Dominic could respond, the reinforced glass of the penthouse mezzanine suddenly violently cracked. A heavy, suppressed thwack echoed through the room, followed instantly by the shattering of a priceless baccarat crystal vase resting on the side console. "Down!" Dante roared, drawing his weapon as another high-caliber round splintered the mahogany paneling above Arthur's head. Dominic didn't think. Instinct, raw and possessive, hijacked his brain. He lunged across the slate table, his massive body colliding with Genevieve's heavy frame, tackling her to the floor, just as a third sniper round shattered the reinforced window where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. They crashed onto the Tibetan rug, Dominic using his entire body to shield her. He expected her to scream. He expected panic. Instead, beneath him, Genevieve let out a short, annoyed sigh. "The Albanians," she murmured, her chest heaving softly against his. "I assumed Dritan would wait until sunset to retaliate for the shipping yards. He is more impulsive than my analysts projected." Dominic stared down at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, his Glock already drawn and aimed at the shattered window. "You knew they were coming?" "I knew they would try," Genevieve corrected calmly, not shifting an inch as another bullet tore through the leather chairs above them. "My ghost operatives are already in the opposing building. Dritan's snipers will be dead in exactly 12 seconds. Count with me, Dominic. 12, 11, 10. Dominic remained perfectly still over Genevieve, his body a rigid shield of muscle and Kevlar-lined fabric. The chaos in the war room was deafening. Vittorio and Dante had flipped the heavy slate table, taking cover behind its impenetrable thickness, returning suppressing fire toward the shattered skyline. 9, 8, 7. Beneath him, Genevieve was an oasis of impossible calm. She wasn't trembling. Her heavy, plush body was completely relaxed against the floorboards, her dark eyes casually scanning the destruction of the penthouse as if evaluating the cost of redecoration. The scent of her, vanilla, expensive silk, and the dark, intoxicating musk of a woman who held the world by the throat, filled Dominic's senses, entirely eclipsing the smell of cordite and pulverized glass. 6, 5, 4. Your men are wasting ammunition, Dominic, Genevieve noted softly, her cheek resting against the rug. The trajectory angle confirms the shooters are on the 42nd floor of the Hudson Yards complex. Handguns are entirely ineffective at this range. 3, 2, 1. The incoming fire ceased abruptly. The sudden silence was more jarring than the gunfire. From a small, diamond-encrusted earpiece hidden beneath her dark hair, a faint metallic voice crackled. "Targets neutralized, madame. The nest is clear." Genevieve reached up, her soft fingers gently wrapping around Dominic's wrist, lowering his weapon. "You can get off me now, Dominic, though I must admit, the weight of you is not entirely unpleasant." Dominic slowly pushed himself up to his knees, his breathing ragged, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of the realization that he was violently, irrevocably obsessed with this woman. He reached down, gripping her forearms, and pulled her up. She was heavy, solid, and magnificent, rising from the shattered glass like a crimson queen, stepping out of the ruins of a conquered city. He didn't let go of her arms. He pulled her flush against his chest. The room was a disaster zone. Alarms were blaring in the distance, and Arthur was hyperventilating behind the overturned table. But Dominic didn't care. He backed Genevieve against a reinforced concrete pillar, caging her in. "You used my penthouse as bait," Dominic growled, his face inches from hers. The fury in his voice was raw, but the dark, dilated pupils of his eyes told a completely different story. "You let Dritton's men take aim at my people to flush them out." "I used your penthouse as an anvil," Genevieve corrected, her voice a low, melodic hum. She didn't shrink away from his anger. She leaned into it, her soft stomach pressing intimately against his hard waist. "And I brought the hat down on them. Dritton thought you were weak because you lost your infrastructure this morning. He thought he was shooting at a crippled king. By tomorrow, the underworld will know that the Moretti family didn't lose their ports. They merged with the Laurent Syndicate. The Albanians just provided the marketing campaign." Dominic's jaw clenched. She was 10 steps ahead, playing three-dimensional chess while the rest of the New York families were playing in the mud. He reached up, his rough thumb brushing a speck of concrete dust from her cheek. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then down the deep, exposed V of her silk robe, tracing the lush, heavy curves that unapologetically demanded space and reverence. In a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves, Genevieve was a monument of soft, terrifying power. "You think you own me now," Dominic whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, possessive purr. His hands slid down her arms to grip her wide hips, his fingers sinking into the soft, yielding flesh, a tactile anchor grounding him in her gravity. Genevieve tilted her chin up, a wicked, triumphant spark in her eyes. "I know I do. Every asset, every bullet, every breath you take in this city now operates under my umbrella." "Then you better understand exactly what you've bought," Dominic snarled. He didn't ask permission. He crushed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. A violent, desperate claiming of territory. He expected her to remain entirely passive, to endure it as a sovereign accepting tribute. But Genevieve matched his ferocity instantly. Her heavy arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her soft lips parting to let him in. She tasted like dark roast coffee, danger and absolute control. Dominic's hands roamed over her body, memorizing the thick, gorgeous lines of her waist, the heavy flare of her thighs. He worshipped the size of her, the way she filled his arms completely, leaving no room for anyone or anything else. He backed her harder against the pillar, his thigh pressing between her legs, drawing a soft, breathy moan from her throat that nearly snapped his self-control in half. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. Genevieve's lips were swollen, her dark hair wildly framing her face. For the first time since she had walked into the Southampton ballroom, she looked slightly flushed, the impenetrable armor of Madame L cracking just enough to reveal the deeply passionate woman beneath. "If I am your sword, Genevieve," Dominic rasped, his forehead resting against hers, "then you are the one who has to hold the handle, and I am not a weapon you can ever put down. Do you understand?" Genevieve smiled, her hands sliding down his chest to grip the lapels of his ruined shirt. "I don't intend to. I am going to sharpen you, Dominic. We are going to bleed this city dry, and then we are going to rebuild it in my image." She turned her head slightly, looking over Dominic's shoulder toward the wreckage of the room. Vittorio and Dante had slowly emerged from behind the slate table, brushing glass from their suits, staring at their boss and the woman who had just usurped him, with a mixture of terror and deep respect. "Vittorio," Genevieve called out, her voice returning to its smooth, commanding cadence. "Call your cleanup crew, have this glass swept up, then contact the heads of the remaining 4 families. Tell them Dominic Moretti is hosting a dinner at the Core Club tomorrow night to discuss the new tax rates on their territories." Vittorio hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Dominic for confirmation. Dominic didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked on Genevieve, a dark, feral grin spreading across his face. "You heard the Queen, Vittorio," Dominic said softly. "Make the calls. Tell them attendance is mandatory. Anyone who doesn't show up, we burn their houses to the ground by midnight." The private dining room at the Core Club, tucked discreetly away on East 55th Street, was a sanctuary designed for the city's apex predators. Its walls were paneled in dark walnut, lined with original Basquiat canvases, and illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a crystal chandelier. Tonight, it smelled of white truffles imported from Alba, roasted dry-aged ribeye, and the metallic, suffocating stench of pure anxiety. 3 men sat around the circular mahogany table. Victor Marino, head of the Sicilian faction, Richard Castellano, the kingpin of the Bronx rackets, and Billy O'Rourke, the ruthless successor to the Irish syndicate after Donovan's bloody exit the night before. They were men who commanded armies of street soldiers, bought judges with briefcases of unmarked bills, and rarely answered to anyone. But tonight, they were sweating. Dominic Moretti sat casually across from them, swirling a glass of vintage Chateau Margaux. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the sharp tailoring doing nothing to hide the lethal, coiled energy of his massive frame. He did not sit at the head of the table. That chair remained empty, a glaring void that put the other 3 bosses on edge. "We came as a courtesy, Dominic," Victor Marino began, his voice laced with forced bravado as he adjusted his silk tie. "But let's be honest. Zenith Logistics was seized. Your shell companies are bleeding. You called us here to beg for a bailout, or to negotiate a surrender before the Albanians finish what they started this morning." Dominic took a slow sip of his wine, his obsidian eyes dancing with a dark, terrifying amusement. "I didn't call you here to negotiate, Victor, and I certainly didn't call you here to surrender. I called you here to introduce you to your new employer." Before Victor could formulate an insult, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open. Genevieve Laurent walked in, and the atmospheric pressure in the room immediately shifted. She was a vision of unapologetic, heavy majesty. She wore a custom, midnight black velvet gown that clung to her wide, soft hips and accentuated her thick waist, the deep neckline showcasing a breathtaking necklace of flawless Harry Winston diamonds. She didn't shrink under the collective stares of the most dangerous men in New York. She expanded, her lush, beautiful frame commanding the space entirely. She walked with that same slow, predatory grace, moving past the armed guards and stepping directly to the head of the table. Billy O'Rourke scoffed, a nervous, derisive sound. "Is this a joke, Moretti? You brought your plus-size distraction to a sit-down? Donovan warned us you were losing your mind. But I didn't think you'd drag your bedroom entertainment into syndicate business." Dominic didn't raise his voice. He didn't even reach for his weapon. He simply set his wine glass down on the mahogany table with a quiet, definitive clink. "Say one more word about her, Billy, and I will personally rip your tongue out of your throat and feed it to the hounds at my estate." The deadly, flat delivery of the threat silenced the room. Genevieve remained entirely unbothered. She gracefully sank into the head chair, adjusting the heavy velvet of her skirt, and fixed her dark, heavy-lidded eyes on the three men. "Gentlemen," Genevieve purred, her voice a rich European melody that dripped with condescension. "My name is Genevieve Laurent, and as of 8 o'clock this morning, I own you." Richard Castellano slammed his hand on the table. "I don't know who you are, lady, but you don't own shit in the Bronx." "Actually, Richard, I do," Genevieve replied smoothly, pulling a slim, encrypted tablet from a hidden pocket in her gown and sliding it across the polished wood. "I bought the municipal bonds funding the police precincts in your district. I also purchased the holding company that owns the deeds to your legitimate strip malls, your mother's nursing home in Boca Raton, and the shipping company that smuggles your product through the Canadian border. If you raise your voice at me again, I will liquidate your entire life before the dessert course arrives." Richard stared at the screen, his face draining of blood as he recognized the routing numbers and corporate seals of his most guarded assets. "This is impossible," Victor whispered, his eyes darting frantically between Genevieve and Dominic. "Who are you?" "The European underworld calls her Madame L," Dominic answered, leaning back in his chair, a feral, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He watched Genevieve with raw, unfiltered devotion. "She is the architect. I am the executioner, and you three are currently breathing borrowed air." Billy O'Rourke's face turned purple with rage. "I'm not paying taxes to a French banker and a whipped dog." He pushed his chair back violently and reached inside his jacket, nodding to his 2 bodyguards standing by the door. "Kill them both!" The bodyguards drew their suppressed weapons, but they didn't aim at Genevieve. They didn't aim at Dominic. They stepped forward and pressed the barrels of their guns directly against the back of Billy O'Rourke's head. Billy froze, his hand hovering over his holster, his eyes widening in absolute terror. Genevieve picked up a silver fork, delicately inspecting it, before looking back at the trembling Irishman. "Loyalty is a commodity, Mr. O'Rourke. Your men were being paid $200,000 a year to protect you. I wired $5 million into each of their offshore accounts 10 minutes before you walked into this building. They work for the Laurent Syndicate now." Dominic stood up slowly. The sheer mass of him cast a long, violent shadow across the table. He walked over to Billy, reached into the man's jacket, and disarmed him with insulting ease. "You see, Billy," Dominic whispered, pressing the barrel of Billy's own gun under the Irishman's chin. "You came here thinking I was weak because I lost my ports. But I didn't lose them. I traded them for the world." Dominic looked at Genevieve, silently asking for the verdict. Genevieve looked at Billy, the fat, brilliant queen evaluating a broken pawn. "The new tax rate for operating in this city is 50% of your gross revenue, payable directly to my holding accounts in Geneva," she announced, her voice echoing coldly in the dining room. "Anyone who objects will share Mr. O'Rourke's fate." She gave Dominic a single, infinitesimal nod. Dominic pulled the trigger. The suppressed gunshot was a soft thwip. Billy collapsed onto the expensive rug, lifeless. Victor and Richard recoiled in their seats, staring in horror at the bleeding corpse, and then up at the monstrous duo who now ruled their entire existence. The brutal enforcer and the brilliant, heavy goddess who held his leash. Genevieve elegantly dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, completely unfazed by the execution. "Now," she smiled, a devastating, terrifying curve of her red lips. "Shall we discuss the appetizers?" Genevieve and Dominic's reign over the criminal underworld became absolute, a terrifying blend of her brilliant, financial checkmates and his unyielding, physical brutality. They proved that true power doesn't fit into the narrow, fragile molds society expects. It carves its own space and demands complete submission. If you were captivated by Genevieve's brilliant takeover and Dominic's fierce devotion, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a dark, thrilling romance, where the underdog turns out to be the ultimate mastermind. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories of power, betrayal, and unapologetic love. See you in the next video.